All right, we're gonna get started now. So we're sorry about the delay. We were having some technical difficulties, but everything's good to go now. So my name is Derek Chen. I'm a part of the programming team of IYC9.
Not yet.
And the title of today's workshop is Empowering Indigenous Voices, Rights, and Representation. And our speaker is Dr. Nikki Berry, who is a UCLA professor in the Department of Education. So yeah, without further ado.
Thank you. Banan na nanaha zo naibi na divo na Nikki Berry na Dogo Albert Ballard na Gaku Vivian Ballard na Tutsoni Diasan Banai na Boto Night. My name is Zoe Naibi, which is the name that my grandparents, Vivian and Albert Ballard, gave to me. And my English name is Dr. Nikki Berry. And I'm from the Shoshone-Bannock tribes of Fort Hall, Idaho, and I'm also of Paiute and Irish descent. And today I'm presenting a workshop called Empowering Indigenous Voices, Rights, and Representation. And I will try to go through this as quick as possible because we're doing an hour presentation in 30 minutes. So we'll go. So the idea is to do a warm-up activity, talk about the history of place, talk about Indigenous erasure, self-determination, and sovereignty and Indigenous futures, and close with the Q&A with an elder who's agreed to come up and chat with us. So for warm-up, I would like you all to imagine, I was going to draw, but let's imagine your home community. So think about your family and any folks who are important to you. Think about the plants and the animals and the waters who are important to you in your home community. Consider the important places or activities that you do in this place. And consider what makes this place important to you and your family. And hold on to that because we'll talk about it more in a minute. Moving to history of place. Sorry, working on two computers. So part of understanding Indigenous rights and representation is understanding Indigenous ties to land. So Indigenous people the world over have land-based cultures. That's what makes us all who we are, meaning our cultures and our ways of knowing and our ways of being are dependent on the land and interdependent with the land. So we're currently sitting in what's now called or currently called Los Angeles. There might be a future in which we have a different word for this place. Situated by the Los Angeles River and the Pacific Ocean, the Chumash and Gabrielino Tongva people call this place their homelands. So this land has been and continues to be a crossroads. So the history of this place really starts with the water. So being at a point between the ocean and rivers that are sacred to the people who call this place home, this water every year brings millions here, millions of birds through the Pacific Flyway, where birds are traveling north to south and south to north, salmon who are traveling between the oceans and the rivers, bringing the ocean nutrients to the land and vice versa, and humans from different parts of the world who continue to meet in this region to trade and harvest, to do ceremony and more. So everyone here has probably heard of land acknowledgements. Land acknowledgements are very popular. They're meant to help us remember whose land it is that we're occupying. And UCLA's official land acknowledgement goes something like, UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of the Tavanar, the Los Angeles Basin, and the South Channel Islands. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the Honukvitam ancestors, the Ahihirom elders, and the Hiohinkem, the relatives and the relations, past, present, and emerging. So land acknowledgements, they're appreciated. And this one in particular was co-written with Tongva people, which is awesome. But land acknowledgements are far from enough. And institutions often use them to tick boxes to say, oh, we met our responsibilities to Indigenous peoples and the lands and waters because we acknowledged that they exist. But really, our responsibilities are much greater than that. So if we are here and we are not Tongva, I'm not Tongva, I'm Indigenous, but not to this land, we are either invading the land temporarily or as a settler, or we are a visitor, or ideally we are guests. And if we are invading, we are here and we're disrespecting the land and the peoples. And as a land acknowledgement, they don't fix that. So if we're visiting, we might be kind to the lands and waters here and respectful toward Tongva and Gabrielino people. But we weren't invited, and that's what makes somebody a guest, being invited. So if we're invited, that means that we're in good relations and ongoing relations with Tongva and Gabrielino people in the lands and waters, and we enact our responsibilities to them, and we don't overstay our welcome. Big gatherings like this in LA often have land acknowledgements, but rarely are these events planned with Tongva or Gabrielino people at the table, and rarely do they consider how to make sure that the gathering benefits the Tongva or Gabrielino peoples in the lands and waters. So I hope that we can all consider how we can be at least kind and respectful while we're here in LA, that we walk gently, that we pick up after ourselves and others, and that we try to be in good relations to the lands and the waters while we're here. So thinking about the home that you were thinking about, your home community. Since we didn't write because we're saving time, what I want you to think about now is the history of your home. What is the home community that you drew? What's the story of that place? Or maybe there's many stories to that place. There surely are. Try to think of a story and hold that story as we move forward through this workshop. And I want you to think about particularly, where does this story that you're thinking of start? Is it start 50 years from now, or does it go back thousands of years? And thinking about your own personal history, that also matters when you're thinking about the history of place. So just some terms, because I'm Indigenous to what is currently called the United States. I think that we should talk through what indigeneity actually means here in the context of the US, because it means different things in different places. So here, indigenous can be applied to plants and animals, including humans. And so indigenous plants and animals are ones that originated in or occur naturally in an area or environment. But defining human communities as indigenous is much more complicated throughout the world, and there's different political aspects of this as well. So generally speaking, though, you might consider yourself indigenous here if you are part of the community with pre-existing sovereignty, who have been living together as a community prior to and continuing through prior to contact with settler populations, which here are of European ancestry. So there are many, 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 many indigenous cultures throughout the world, and we all actually have indigenous ancestry somewhere. All of us have land-based ancestors somewhere, but whether we currently have a claim to indigeneity is another thing. And it matters not just if you have a claim yourself, but if your people claim you. So here in the United States, indigenous people are often referred to as Native Americans or American Indian or Native or First Nations, and we can be more specific too by naming particular tribes. So if you don't know whose land you occupy when you're traveling or where you live or where you work, there's a really great resource called nativeland.ca, and it's starting to become more global, which is really exciting. They're also kind of based on open source information. So if you see an inaccuracy, or if there's your particular people aren't represented, you can contact them and they will work with you to fix that. Continuing on with a couple of terms. So today, most indigenous people in the US live in urban centers. Most of us do, about over 70% of us do. But many of us are still living in our homelands. So your homelands are the place where we've had ties for generations and generations. So for example, Tongva people who live in LA are still living in their original homelands. Reservations are places where the US government forced us to stay when the first Europeans colonized the US. And the reservation lands are sometimes in a tribe's original homelands, and sometimes they are not. And there are other words for reservations here too, like reserves or rancherias. And some people use the term territory as well to talk about homelands. But no matter where Native people live, we can all have good relationships with the land that we are living in, and we can uphold our original teachings there. So just going back to this native land map. So the nativeland.ca map there, that's the region we're in now, the one on the left. But the one on the right, those are the lands that are reservation or rancheria lands. They're the ones where Indigenous people have some decision-making power. So everywhere you go, the land here is Indigenous land. But do we have political power in all of those places? We're working on it, is the answer. So zooming out from LA a little bit and thinking more globally and, well, from a US perspective still, and just to put into scale the Indigenous land loss over time. In the context of the US, there's a really illustrative map and video here, and I put the links up there in tiny URL form so that you can play with this on your own time, because the interactive map is actually really cool. You can highlight each section and find associated treaties and policies. But just to show the scale here, I'll speed it up a little too. And really, this should be updated a little bit there. Oklahoma has since reinstated a lot of their political power over the legally in the land there in Oklahoma. So there should be a little bit more blue there now. Sorry, we'll go to the next slide. But in speaking about that, it's important. I want to introduce the term erasure or absence. So Indigenous erasure, there's dynamics of absence and presence that matter here for Indigenous people and beyond just in the United States. And this all has to do with systemic racism and anti-indigeneity. So Indigenous absence is part of systemic racism. And it means, we'll use absence and erasure interchangeably. I prefer erasure because it shows that this happened to us and it is happening to us. So this happens all the time. It's just that people forget about us. They might acknowledge that we exist, but then they, we'll talk, even in social justice movements, we'll talk about, racial justice, but then not include Indigenous people at the table or in leadership conversations. So this happens also in historical representations of us. We are presented in various forms in the media, in school as pre-1900 without a present or a future. And this happens as well when understandings of Indigenous peoples or histories are told through settler colonial perspectives. It happens when there are stereotyped narratives and understandings of Indigenous peoples and cultures and knowledges and our societal systems. And this really goes hand in hand with anti-Blackness in the United States, because the United States was built on stolen land using stolen labor. This land wouldn't be what it is without having exploited both Indigenous and Black communities here. And that is ongoing. As long as settler colonialism is a thing here, so will be anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity. Thinking about this, it's actually a global problem, Indigenous erasure. And it matters on a deep scale when we're thinking about things like climate change. So Indigenous territories contain 80% of the world's biodiversity. And that is not an accident. That's because of our relationships with land, because of the way that we interact with land. Yet only a quarter of the land outside of Antarctica is actually in Indigenous hands and under our leadership and our decision making. So at a time when 95% of the World Wildlife Fund top 200 climate change hotspots are in Indigenous territories, we already have the answers that we need to create better futures. We need to look to Indigenous peoples for leadership now more than ever. Yet, systemic erasure and racialized minimization of Indigenous peoples is still a central dynamic of research, education, and society. And this is quoting Dr. Megan Bang in the United States and elsewhere. And as an example, 80% of US educational standards around Indigenous people dictate the teaching of Indigenous people in the context pre-1900. So they're not talking about our issues in the present, and they're not allowing us to imagine a future, or anyone to imagine a future for us in the United States. And this shows up in the media as well. So in 2020, a CNN exit poll about the election wrote that 6% of voters were something else racially. This happens all the time. Native people get asterisks out of research, and we get asterisks out of exit polls, despite the fact that we matter. And in the 2020 election, for example, Native people helped secure Biden's election, which is very obvious by these maps here in Arizona. Yet we're called something else in the CNN polls. So the answer to this is Indigenous presencing. So instead of erasing us, include us. So talk about us in the present tense instead of the past tense. If you talk about us in the past tense only, it's an act of erasure. The present tense recognizes our existence and our futures. Acknowledge that Indigenous people are diverse ourselves. There are still some commonalities among us, like our shared experience of settler colonialism or our relationships with lands and waters, but we are diverse peoples and we have differences even within our own tribes. Know that Indigenous peoples have had and continue to have complex societies and ways of understanding the world. Know that you can't assume someone is Indigenous by their skin tone or their features. And know that it is necessary to teach all children whose land that we live, work, and study on, and to know the history and presence of Indigenous peoples. So transitioning a little to leadership and governance, and we're going to talk about sovereignty and self-determination. And I was going to couch this in talking about federal Indian policy here in the United States, but I will skip that because that's a lot of history that's important to know, and we can come back to it in the Q&A if you really would like to know more about it. But talking about tribal sovereignty and self-determination. So tribal sovereignty means that we have the power to govern ourselves. So a tribe has the power to govern themselves, govern their members, make decisions about land. The power of sovereign governments includes the power to enact laws, establish systems of justice, require people to abide by those established laws, to tax people, to zone properties, to regulate hunting and fishing, et cetera, as any nation does. Self-determination is part of this. So it's the agency of a group of people who have a separate and distinct identity to determine their own future in their own way. And this is necessary to truly enact tribal sovereignty. This is the power of tribes to govern themselves. And there's some principles of self-determination that I think are important to recognize. So self-governance or control of judiciary processes, continuing traditional practices and reciprocal relations with the lands and waters of our homelands, to gather and hunt on our homelands, which includes fishing, to educate our youth in culturally resurgent ways, and to generally protect our people. So sovereignty and self-determination together allow us to be governed by people who are part of and understand our communities, and therefore are more likely to follow our visions about our community's future. So this is more than just colonization and harm. So the answer is relationships with lands and waters and each other. So zooming into that principle of self-determination, that Indigenous peoples have the right to relations with lands and waters. Healthy, sustainable relationships between humans, lands, and waters is necessary for all of us considering climate change. And presencing Indigenous people in your work and activism means looking to these Indigenous relationships with land as a model for us all. And I was going to show this beautiful video that you can look up on YouTube and watch yourself called The Honorable Harvest by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a renowned scientist and Potawatomi scholar. And this video is just beautiful, and it kind of gets at some of the relationships that we're talking about here. So in the video, Robin Wall Kimmerer says that one way to connect with lands is through the honorable harvest. And she asks, if plants are our teachers, what are their lessons and how might we become better students? So I want you all to consider what connections that you see between sustainable relationships between humans, lands, and waters and Indigenous self-determination. and thinking about your home that we were talking about before, that we were holding before. So what aspects of the natural world are figured into your idea of home when you think about home? Is the natural world a central feature? Is it backgrounded? Is it just not existent? You weren't really thinking of it at all? And what kinds of responsibilities to place do you and your family think about when you're thinking about home? And are they aligned with these principles of self-determination and these relationships between humans, lands, and waters? I also briefly want to just talk about some theories of change. So when we're talking about solidarity, part of us gaining our sovereignty and self-determination requires solidarity, and particularly between Black and Indigenous communities here in the United States, as considering our intertwined history and our ability to build a future together that we both envision. So there's theories of change that I think all of these are important. So dismantling change, which is like the burn it to the ground, decolonizing change, we need that. We also need building change. We need different models, and we need to see that. And those different models are already being enacted in Black and Indigenous communities in the United States now. We just need to look to them and raise them up. So just to show some really beautiful examples of how these practices are being enacted every day. We have art, we have gardening, we have occupations happening. We have kids going out with elders and rivers that people thought were destroyed. And these rivers are being brought back to health. And not only that, their relationships with humans, the rivers' relationships with humans are being healed. And this is all happening. So what I want us to do is take some time to dream. So thinking about your home, what positive futures do you imagine for your home community, and how might we get there? And in particular, how might we look to Indigenous people to help us? So with that, I would like to invite up an elder from the Choctaw Nation, not just an elder, a leader who we would like to field questions about Indigenous self-determination and sovereignty, climate change, and what this means for Indigenous people and for us all. So we'll take questions now.
Lamia Shonabish, Dasakamatli Panani, Dr. Nikki, and Beating Woman. I am Choctaw Muskoki, Yamasee, Mexican, Mayan, many nations as we are. By my tribe, I'm a spiritual elder and chief. One of the chiefs designated by my tribal principal chief, Rashid Stone Coyote Patton. And here to do what I can. I really deeply appreciate all that you brought forward. We do need to burn down the decolonization. I'm with you. And what I might say, or just add before I answer any questions, is I also, my teachings come from Lakota. I'm still learning. And I follow the White Buffalo prophecies as well. One of the things too is, as you very in a beautiful way have spoke of our nations as land-based people. One of the things I'll add to that, if I may, is that we are also spiritually based cultures. So the relationship with the four sacred elements of land, water, air, and fire as not just a physical presence, but is the spiritual understanding of tradition and ceremony that that brings us to a place of being these very amazing people that we call the two-leggeds of the humans that are still here in spite of all that's been done to us, right? We are still here. Aho, matakiasan.
So questions? Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There might also be questions in the chat, and I don't know how to do that. Gary.
All right. Thank you both so much for being here today, and thank you so much for the land acknowledgement. I think it is so important because without knowing the history or the meaning behind the land of which we stand upon and the waters of which we drink and the air of which we breathe, we cannot do better. And also land acknowledgement here in what we now know as this country, but is like the original indigenous land, is also part of the greater global narrative of which we are seeing all around the world, in which we are pushing back and fighting against colonialism, imperialism. And we are seeing this in Sudan and in Congo. We're seeing this in West Papua and Haiti. We are seeing this with the Uyghur resistance, the Tibetan people, the Kurdish. And of course, we are seeing this with the Palestinian plight, where they are pushing back and they are resisting the occupation and the oppression, and they are advocating for the liberation. And so ultimately, my question is, with all of this context, is how can we be more of a united front? Because often I feel like it's happening in isolated spaces, or as we're seeing in social media and in the news, we are seeing that certain communities or certain nations are getting the spotlight and others are not. So how can we, in the global narrative, and especially because of course we have so many people joining us from online all over the world, how can we be more united to continue to push back against the colonialism, the imperialism, this context that we find ourselves still living in today, for this resistance and movement for liberation? Thank you.
That is a very, very big question that I don't know I have the wisdom to to answer well.
Thank you. You know, and for our audience, in our ways, we call, I ask to forgive me first for speaking before my elders speak, especially of those of the Tongva and the Chumash people. In that respect, I have walked with both tribes, nations in ceremony and in various gatherings that we have. I believe one of the things I believe that in present day, you know, we have what people refer to as casino tribes. And in those ways, you know, they think if you come from a particular, identify as a Native American, you know, people give a thought that you come from some casino tribe and you have all this money, as it's so called. But one of the things is that it separates us from the tribes who don't have casinos as well, and empowering our community within our nation. And I speak about the tribal reservations generally. But also there are casino tribes here in California who are beginning and have been actually for some time helping the outside community, as we refer to help bring education, support schools and other outlying communities to demonstrate that we are moving from the alienation of our, not only between ourselves, but also what we refer to as the outside world. And this is a really beautiful thing that needs to continue. So as we continue moving more into the inclusivity of the discussion of what this conference is all about, on not only on a local level, but of course on a global level. And as very well presented by Dr. Nikki here, you know, she has demonstrated, you know, that we need to continue to be in the present day and not always speak of the past, you know. And one of the things, of course, that we learn is that the educational system has to be revamped. When your conquerors are actually creating the history books that our children are learning from, I have learned, having been born here in East Los Angeles myself in the foster care system and coming back to my now place of origin of my own path, is that what I have learned is that in order to change education here in California, you have to go through the state legislature. And that's why the growth of charter schools began to arise. But we need to actually bring this forward because, as people have spoken already in this conference, we need to give the power of voice. I believe the young woman who spoke of, and also the general consul or consul general who spoke, said we need to bring harmony back to nature, and that we can only stand on our own truth. And in sovereignty, we have our truth, and it must be listened as well as spoken to, and must be not only recognized, but acknowledged and embraced by those who have so long dominated us and are continuing to actually create the erasure that is not only of the past, but still exists today, as I have seen in our ceremonies. Oh,
Okay, I see. We are at time. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Do you have final thoughts?
I have a final thought. I'd like to put something out there because here in Indian country, in different places, we speak about the commissions of what they call reconciliation. And according to Mark Charles, who is a Dene elder on a TED Talk, he delineates that, aside from the Wampanoag people who maybe met the Pilgrims back then and had some kind of agreement, that we are not in a place of reconciliation, folks. We need to actually come to the truth that as the westward move across this country to take the lands, to steal the lands, we must enter into talks of conciliation, where we acknowledge, they acknowledge, the colonizer acknowledges what they've done and own up to what it is that needs to be restored. And so with that, let us correct a reconciliation that we need to come from a place of conciliation and not speak of it from our side to the other side. It's the truth is what it is that we need to stand on. Thank you.
Thank you, Us.
Did you end the stream?